Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Northeast Renewable Diesel Working Group. Excited to be reconvening for the third session. We've covered a lot of topics already, brought a lot of different folks to the table. Just stoked to keep this conversation moving forward and can you keep connecting the dots with folks. So as always, it'd be really great to just know who's on the call, not just for Peggy and myself, because we have all this information already, but just for other folks that are on this call. If you could just introduce yourself quickly in the chat, just drop your name, organization, and where are you calling in from? We were looking at the registration the other day. We have a lot of folks calling in from all around New England, but we also have some folks starting to join from outside of New England. So a couple New York folks, a couple folks from all around. So it's good to see that we're reaching bigger audience. Quick reminder, this working group is being hosted by myself and my colleague Peggy. We are the directors of our respective state clean cities and communities coalitions. And so for our agenda today, I'm going to do a really quick welcome and recap. Going to be talking about some renewable diesel procurement strategies, as well as a pilot overview, which we're excited to share. We're going to be talking about some renewable diesel in adjacent markets, which could be an interesting strategy for sort of building that bulk demand and getting some more supply to the Northeast. And then Peggy and I have a few quick updates to share from some conversations and some conferences that we went to over the past quarter since our last meeting, and then we'll do some wrap up and next steps. So, just a quick reminder of the inception of this working group. Had some really good interest. Some fleets in the state of Maine reach out, interested about renewable diesel. New York City had announced a citywide transition to convert their full fleet to renewable diesel, which is about 60 million gallons, which is a pretty big statement and kind of sparked a lot of additional interest. Now that we know that it's not just a California fuel anymore and it's starting to make its way to our neck of the woods. We hosted a renewable diesel webinar in September of 2024, which drew a lot of more interest. And so building off of that interest, we are going to be facilitating this working group session and then hopefully coming up with a game plan for continuing this work after we wrap up our fourth working group session. So as always, we want to thank the National Renewable Energy Lab for funding this work. This is through the Jumpstart program, and our objectives of this working group are to assess current and future demand for renewable diesel, especially in the New England states and beyond. Looking at renewable diesel in the heavy duty on and off-road sector and applications, determining filling needs, capacity, training needs, cost effectiveness, and transition to renewable diesel. Our goals are really to connect people, talk about market development opportunities, and then really look at fleet solutions for implementation. So some of the topics that we've covered so far were Renewable Diesel 101. We gave an introduction with Neste, and then we did a logistics overview for our last session, talked about fueling, transportation, all that good stuff. And today we're going to be talking around policy considerations and how that can really impact market expansion in our region. So there's a lot of things to touch on. So I'm going to keep going pretty fast here. This is just a recap of our working group last time. We had two really fantastic presenters from Massport Authority and Boyne Resorts talking about actual renewable diesel usage in their fleets. And then wanted to summarize quickly some of the renewable diesel pros and challenges that we've sort of identified through this working group. Some of the pros, it's drop in fuel, lower life cycle emissions than conventional diesel. There's claims of cleaner burning and lower particulate matter, and it's an immediate solution for fleets right now. some of the challenges that have come up, and I think, we're working right now with the right people to find solutions and talk about, and hopefully approach this from an education standpoint to alleviate any concern, is considerations for cold climate and what that fuel mix could look like, exploring the idea of group procurement for fueling and pricing. So really looking at those economy of scale opportunities, and then identifying an anchor fleet or a group of fleets that are interested in either piloting the fuel or incorporating it into their mix, to get that collective demand. Another quick thing that we want to reiterate is renewable diesel is not biodiesel. That's a really big thing that we're trying to hone in on here. Although there is very similar inputs to the fuel, renewable diesel has the same ASTM specs as petroleum diesel and can be used as a direct replacement or drop-in fuel for petroleum diesel. And when we're looking at renewable diesel, we're also considering the carbon intensity of the fuel. So not just the tailpipe emissions, but really looking at the farm to fuel, or what is it, wheel to well of the fuel. Another thing to consider is these bio-based fuels are typically categorized as biogenic emissions, which are slightly different for reporting purposes than maybe traditional petroleum diesel might be. We also just want to sort of reemphasize that renewable diesel in the Northeast is growing and is continuing to grow. The SUNY School District in New York is utilizing renewable diesel right now. We heard from Massachusetts Port Authority that they had just wrapped up their pilot program and are looking to move towards mass deployment of renewable diesel in all of their operational vehicles. And then Burlington Electric is running a pilot program, that, as we learn more about that, we'll share this information out with the group. And then Boyne Resorts as well is using the fuel in some of their mountains out west and looking to incorporate it into mountains out east. So with that, I will turn it over to Peggy to introduce some of our speakers today. We've sort of broken it down into two different sections today. The first section will be covering some pilots that are happening in the region that have just wrapped up and some lessons learned, and talking about some various procurement strategies. And then following that, we'll be talking about renewable diesel opportunities in adjacent markets and how that could play a role in bringing more availability to the Northeast. So with that, I'll pass it over to Peggy.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So as John mentioned, we're going to start with two speakers first, then we'll have some Q&A, and then we'll move into the second section. So first, I'd like to introduce Joe Natale. Joe serves as Director of Business Development and Terminal Operations and Project Development at Chemstar, where he also leads the renewable focus subsidiary Renstar. Joe is at the forefront of developing rail, marine, and truck infrastructure to expand access to renewable diesel, biodiesel, and SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, throughout New England. So Joe, you want to take it over and share your information on the pilot and procurement RFP issues.
Thanks, Peg. Appreciate that. And thank you to both you and John for leading in the hard work and diligence you put into this. Hello, everyone. Sorry for the backdrop. I have a last minute appointment that I needed to attend that came up yesterday, and I'm sitting in the parking lot to get to that once we're done here. As Peggy said, Joe Natale, Chemstar, Renstar. We are a family-owned and operated marketing and logistics group. We pride ourselves on our relationships and solving logistical solutions for our customer base and hopefully the market as well. As some of you may know, Renstar was awarded a pilot program last year with the MBTA, and it was managed by Keolis Commuter Services. That pilot RFP started mid-24. was awarded late in 24, but did not start until Q2 of this year, 2025. The pilot was designated for one location, three locomotives. And the reason being was that some of the folks at the MBTA wanted reassurances that this was in fact a drop in fuel. So they allocated three older models, I'll call it, for the fueling project. Very quickly, they realized that this was in fact a drop in fuel. The staff on hand at one location, which was Newburyport, Massachusetts, had indicated, yeah, we don't even, we see the difference in the stack on the locomotive. And they quickly expanded the location and the locomotives that we were fueling. We then expanded to Reedville, Massachusetts, and we were fueling basically every one of the MBTA locomotives on the north end. The original procurement gallon total was just north of 400,000 gallons. We met that below budget in time, and it was so effective that the T actually allowed us to expand that by another 100,000 gallons. We utilized the entire 100,000 gallons, and we came in at just shy of 506,000 gallons. The original RFP with the extension was for 506,000 gallons exactly, and we were below budget. That took a lot of hard work. That was not easy, and it took a lot of attention to detail. Some of the program updates are where we are today. It was a very successful program. There were no incidents, no releases, no issues with the locomotives, as I said. And we never, along with our carrier, we never missed a scheduled delivery. And just to give you an idea of the complexity of the schedule, Newburyport was 11:30 p.m. to 1 a.m. was our window to fuel those locomotives. We never missed a scheduled delivery. And then Reedville, which was roughly 10,000 gallons a day, was the same time slot. It was 11 o'clock at night till about 1:30 in the morning. But then we had to come back at 10 o'clock and refuel till 12 noon, basically to keep all those locomotives moving and no issues with running out of fuel. We all called it a great success, so much so that the T then had suggested, all right, let's start working on expanding and growing that. Let's go buy more gallons for November and December. The problem with that is when you're going through an RFP process, that at that time, which we're looking at September, October, the suppliers look at that as spot supply. And there are no quote unquote discounts granted to that, like it was when we went through the RFP program and had some time and had some negotiation points to get a better cost of supply. In addition, when you think about where the supply was coming from, we partnered with Global in this. They were great to work with. We took some historical gallons that were in tank from 2024, unincentivized European production. And we were able with that structure to give them the best cost of supply. But as you roll into Q4, winter season comes in, and RD is a specialty product that is taking tank capacity for something that is utilized to the likes of heating oil. So that's kind of difficult when you have a product that, is competing against something that's so relied upon in the New England market, especially everything north of Boston, where there's limited pipeline capacity with natural gas. So the pricing did not work. We are working with them on a rail supply solution. This is what they want us to drive. And we are going to be hopefully supplying that through our Providence, Rhode Island rail location. We presently are up and operating, and in that location, we supply biodiesel to groups like Global, as an example, and Inland for their mandated 20% blending needs. But we are also working with the T on utilizing historical infrastructure, which is sidings that have been out of service for many years, maybe some track in some of their switch yards, to create a rail direct play for the supply of the RD into their fueling program. Hopefully, we can expand upon that and go into the buses and et cetera and other industries. Just as an idea of the magnitude of the volume, not only was the MBTA the first commuter rail system in North America that issued this pilot type of program, but they are also the largest consumer of diesel in the state of Massachusetts. Between rail, marine, and locomotives and rail, I believe the number is just north of 20 million gallons annually. So it's a big number, and obviously trying to impact and trying to lower the carbon intensity and the carbon emissions, there's got to be a really rigorous process in place for the eventual slow movement into a RD type of play. That's not going to be easy. When you look at the East Coast version of an LCFS with clean heat standards coming on the horizon, and how is that going to impact RD, biodiesel, heating oil? Again, it goes back to to working with the tank capacities, working with the globals of the world, and trying to be very strategic and try to be very efficient to not only supply this customer but all of our other customers as well. There was a lot of lessons learned, and when you look at that type of volume and depending upon the eventual feedstocks that the state chooses, you're looking at lowering your carbon intensity by 80% if you're using a waste feedstock, such as used cooking oil, animal fats, distillers corn oil, or maybe 50 to 60% when you look at a plant-based molecule such as soybean oil. Right now, there are no incentives in Massachusetts. There are no incentives in Maine, as far as I'm aware of, nor is there any in Vermont. In as far as biodiesel incentives go, it is a mandated state in Rhode Island at 20%, but that product also uses the same feedstocks. So as you can tell, there's a lot of homework that goes into procuring this gallon. For the RFP, which something I shared with John and Peggy, and they thought there would be a lot of interest in discussing here, is when we spoke to Keolis on the way the RFP was issued. Historically, folks, RFPs go out certain times a year with various groups within the state. You have Massport issuing it at certain times. You have the MBTA issuing it at another time. I think there needs to be more collaboration when you do that. As you do that, you're aggregating more gallons, which gives you a better negotiation point when you are trying to buy the gallons. And B, for example, we just went through an RFP here recently with the state of Massachusetts, but we stepped away from it because it was for December startup, and we could not price that accordingly without the time that we felt was needed. So we respectfully bowed out of that one. But you're also fighting against, when you're procuring this, you're also, again, fighting against heating oil season. So there needs to be a lot of strategy in the logistics on how that's going to be supplied. And that's where it starts to unravel into a rail type of supply mechanism. We also, historically, what we see on RFPs are, give us your number. It's not worded that way, but we worked with the T and Keolis, and it was a line item structure. Basically, what's the cost basis? It is at a NYMEX CME basis. What is the tank terminal or suppliers differential? In other words, what is their profit? What does the trucking look like? What is that price? If we do this as a rail play, how does that impact the freight rate now that you have a rail freight rate on top of the truck coming from a rail yard. We were able to put together that pricing, and we're fortunate enough to win it based upon those layered line items versus, your RD is $10 a gallon. It's not the number, but given an example, and there's no transparency on what those costs actually are. So working with Global, they helped us on the supply piece. We put on our cost of capital, we put on our logistic charges, and then we worked with Dennis K. Burke on the transportation piece at one section, and then Fuelman, which is based out of New Bedford, Massachusetts, to fuel Reedville. It was a very well-run operation. And again, the positive impacts are that the T is slowly going to look at increasing those volumes on RD utilization. And hopefully as a group, we can do more. In addition, when you start to think of, I know this is on the renewable diesel side, but I recently spoke at a climate beacon function in Boston, and we presented with Massport, specifically the group that runs the airports. And the idea is to bridge the gap with RD using the same producers that produce RD will produce SAF, using a solid logistics play and bridging the gap on net zero in 2031 in the state of Massachusetts, which also includes sustainable aviation fuel. So there's so many more moving parts to this, but it's one solution. It's one producer, not one producer, but one origination point that can produce either or, and then using historical capital, the rail system, paying the freight, using out of service rail yards and grants that are structured, such as an IRAP, to bring those rail yards back into service, and what we call floating storage, minimizing the impact of having to build more tanks to do that, and working with tank farms with potential connectivity to our rail terminal and any existing tanks that are available. I know that's a lot of information. I tried to go through it quick to leave some time for Q&A. I have to jump before the end. I believe Peggy and John can share my contact information and or cell phone, and Gracie Williams, who is a big part of what we do at Renstar. She's my right and left arm. She handles all the headaches in the background. Either one of us will make ourselves readily available to help with any questions and help to be part of the solution.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe. And as I mentioned in the chat, folks, we can share Joe's suggested line items for an RFP for renewable diesel when we send you the link to the recording and the write-up. But now we're going to head over to listen to Matt Coda. So Matt is the founder, fellow Vermonter, the founder of Meadow Hill Consulting. Meadow Hill helps businesses navigate Vermont's complex political, regulatory, and economic landscape, as most Vermonters know. His firm provides strategic management and advocacy services to trade associations with a focus on energy, transportation, and economic development. Matt is also the founder of Split the Ticket Fund, which has helped organize the delivery of more than 125,000 gallons of free heating fuel to Vermont families in need. Certainly at this time of year, we're all appreciative of Matt's work with that. So Matt, go ahead and take it over. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. And I think the relevant part of my resume I sort of left off, which is I served on the Vermont Climate Council as the fuel sector representative, and I also worked on the development of the clean heat standard. I was part of the technical advisory group that wrestled with that very difficult piece of legislation it has not been enforced, but we are still, it is still a document that is alive and well. It could be considered at a further date. And the important part here, where it comes to the conversation about renewable diesel, is that in both the Clean Heat Standard and in discussions with the Climate Council about creating a climate action plan for Vermont, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in all sectors by 40% by the end of the decade. Renewable diesel, biodiesel have been part of the conversation, which I'm very proud of, because I think there is a sentiment that it has to be more than just electricity in order to reduce our carbon emissions from fossil fuels, that it needs to be some sort of fuel that can be a drop-in. And what's beautiful about renewable diesel is that we have about 60 million gallons a year that we use of diesel for our on-road vehicles. We use about 40 million gallons for off-road. Our forestry and our ag economy uses a significant amount of diesel fuel as well. And then we have about 75 to 80 million gallons a year of heating oil. Heating oil is still the dominant heating product in Vermont, more so than propane, more so than natural gas. But our challenges are obvious, which is we don't have any mandates, we don't have any pipelines, we don't have any specific programs that incentivizes or compels dealers to buy it. So it's all about price. And a third of our product comes from Canada, comes from the refineries in Montreal or St. John, and they have their own incentive structure. So I'm telling stuff that you already know, but the maze of different requirements and regulations from state to state and from country to country make it challenging for our industry to sell a lower carbon product, whether it's our gasoline stations or our truck stops that are selling diesel fuel, or our truckers that are moving gallons to the farmers out in the fields or the forests, or our small pedal trucks that are moving gallons to the heating oil tanks. They don't own any oil wells. They don't own any refineries. They would sell whatever that they can move and make a profit at. So there has been general agreement that renewable diesel is a fantastic product. It's drop-in fuel, and it may very well have dramatic effect on our greenhouse gas emissions and help us meet our statutory required goals here in Vermont. However, without a refinery, without a dedicated supply, without a price that is comparable, or without a compelling regulatory structure that would encourage its adoption, we're at a crossroads. And I've talked with Peggy about this a lot, which is, how do we get to a place where not just that it's accepted at the regulatory level, but it's also adopted by the marketers that I work with, both transportation and heating fuel. And what is the compelling regulatory structure that either through incentives or disincentives or mandates in order to make it happen? And we're not there yet, but I'm glad we're still in the conversation. Thanks, Peggy.
Matt, I was hoping for like ending on a high note. No, I certainly appreciate that. And this is, kind of one of, why we have this particular group of folks on today to talk a little bit about how can we talk about combining the on-road and the off-road transportation with the thermal sector. And I know Ken Jones is going to speak a little bit later on the clean heat standard. But what's the secret sauce to kind of for smaller states like Vermont and Maine in particular, to think about, or maybe on a regional level, to think about what's the anchor fleet, or what's the quantity of fuel that we need to be asking for in order to create the demand to get the supply here. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's getting it to a price comparable point to our traditional supply. I mean, it'd be wonderful if we could develop a new terminal in the Northeast, but it's not going to happen. We're closing terminals. We're not opening new ones. So it's figuring out how to get that supply to Albany, to the Port of Montreal, New York Harbor, and Springfield, Mass, through the pipeline. So once that is resolved, or if we can figure out how to get a gallon of renewable diesel that is it can be it doesn't have to be better, but it can at least be price comparable to diesel fuel, heating oil, dyed diesel fuel, into those ports where we traditionally pick up that product. That's going to be the key to this happening.
Great. And then Joe, back to you if you're still able to, I know you're jumping off soon, thinking about the floating storage. How does the floating storage idea work with some of the issues that Matt mentioned, looking at like we're not building more terminals, but getting our fuel supply up here?
Yeah, that's let me just clear that up. It's not a rail car floating in the water. It's basically what we look at is, rail logistics. It's not that I'm a railroad head or we're a railroad head, but when you think about the origin points of this, whether it be Montana, the Gulf Coast, even California, it's not going to make economic sense to move gallons or barrels via water, in my opinion, unless something drastically changes, and then you're going into a tank farm that, to Matt's point, is either gone or in the plans to be demolished. Rail, there's plenty of rail infrastructure, and it would be, utilizing that rail infrastructure, whether it's historical and needs to be updated and brought into compliance, or existing, and then working with the railroads and getting the best rates from these origin points and show them. And we've done that. We did this with this program, is talking to these class ones, talking to these short lines and explaining to them, you're missing the value as, and I'm not trying to impact the marine world, but a barge is probably going to be more cost effective, but you got to think about where that barge would originate from. Rail would be basically that, rail into a yard using the T is a little bit easier example because they have their own equipment where they can switch out. But, you look at groups like, I'll use Ray Energy as an example in Vermont. They have a rail yard, they have a rail system. Do we talk to them about expanding that capability, to allow for rail to truck transfers on the until a pipeline system comes into place to get to the regions where Matt had indicated. And I think that's the only way at this point we're going to move that needle. It's not going to be cheaper by any means, but it's trying to figure out the cheapest cost of supply by digging into each one of those line items and get the best net back value for not only the producer, but for the end user as well.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Matt. John, did you have something, sir?
Yeah. I was just so I think we've come to the point in our third session here. We keep hearing this need for group procurement or some sort of group procurement process. And I'm curious if anybody has any insight on like what type of group or entity makes sense to lead such an endeavor, or what type of group will typically coordinate that type of process. We at the municipal level can do group procurement for towns and cities in our region for things like road salt and some various other things. But yeah, curious to hear anybody's thoughts on what type of entity might be best to lead such a process.
Steven. I bet you have something to say about it.
Yeah, I jumped right into it, and I apologize. This is my first meeting, and I just haven't been able to make the other. So you may have spoken about this, and if you have, just give me the stop sign. But a regional entity promoting a low carbon fuel standard, which to me, on a regional basis, makes the most sense because you are squeezing the carbon out of all liquid fuels for all applications, whether they're public transportation, whether it's municipal, whether it's airlines, whether it's heavy duty trucks, railroads, vessels, to the extent that you can regulate them. A regional low carbon fuel standard seems to be, it may not be the easiest to implement or design, although it's not reinventing the wheel because several other states, as we know, on the West Coast have a low carbon fuel standard. But it seems to me that's the simplest solution to a regional problem of trying to squeeze carbon, and not just promoting the use of RD, but other low carbon liquid fuels as well in all the liquid fuel sectors. And it seems to me, and I apologize if there are air folks from the states that are on this call that are associated with NISCOM, but they would seem to be, that would seem to be the entity that that should take this under their wing. And quite frankly, I've seen no response from them, and maybe that's misplaced. Maybe I've missed something. I know they tried it a number of years ago and went over like a lead balloon, but the world has changed. Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York didn't have the low carbon, the carbon reduction mandates that they have on the books now. So simple answer is, I think NESCOM should be involved in this discussion.
Thanks, Stephen. I think some people agree with that. And I think on the a regional approach is certainly far more productive, again, for small states like Vermont. I'm not going to speak for the state. I know there's some staties on here, but you know, if Massachusetts or New York move on something like that, then it's more likely that Vermont could kind of hitch to that wagon. So there's a question in the chat from Alex. For anyone who can estimate, what is the price per gallon a customer like MBTA would pay for their 500,000 gallons? And to Matt Coda's point, what is the price difference to be overcome? Certainly, just quickly, what we have heard, and this is in our research across the United States, the delta between regular diesel and renewable diesel can be anywhere from 25 cents to $1. And that's outside of states with like California with a low carbon fuel standard. But Matt, I'm not sure if you want to answer that. And Joe, maybe quickly, if you want to talk about any pricing the MBTA had on their fuel.
Sure. Obviously, under confidentiality, I can't give out specifics, but it was a basis of NYMEX plus a differential that ran. I wish it was a quarter, as low as a quarter for the sake of the RFP, but it wasn't there. Somewhere between that quarter and $1 for on the supply side. And then on the trucking side, depending upon the length of haul, it went anywhere from 15 cents a gallon to about a quarter a gallon. And then there was our margin, which was baked into that original margin. I think the end number was about 350 to 375 a gallon, just for transparency purposes. And there was no special discount given because it was the MBTA. Everyone that we priced this with was trying to get their California pref in there, for lack of a better word. But in addition, we are pricing that via rail now, and all the producers seem to be in line, and it's looking like about $1 over a gallon NYMEX basis into the Northeast, and then all the moving parts of logistics and operations.
Thank you. All right, Matt, did you have a response to any other price points that you see in your world?
I don't. I would defer to Steve or any of the other experts that watch this thing. So sorry.
No, that's great. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but is Jesse Tyrion on here? I know he's our colleague from Montana, Yellowstone, Teton, Clean Cities, and I know he has in the Intermountain West some information.
How's it going?
Thanks, Jesse.
We are still seeing, I actually filled my truck up yesterday and it's still $1 a gallon premium versus number 2. It works differently here. They charge the premium that was there when they filled that tank up. Since it's not widely used, sometimes that tank can last months. So there's no fluctuation in the price. If diesel went way up, that would stay the same. Then it would actually be close to parity. But a lot of fluctuations depending on how we get it. Sometimes we truck it out of the middle of Idaho or Salt Lake via pipeline, and it comes all the way up here. So that load could be different than if we trucked it from somewhere else. A lot of variables, but it's typically been about $1 a gallon premium in the region.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that.
Awesome. Does anybody else have any questions before Joe and Matt have to hop off? I think both of them have to hop before we conclude at 1:30. So Oh yeah, Joe's hopping now. So if anybody has any additional questions for them, feel free to send them our way. We will connect you all to Joe or Matt. They both have a ton of great information to share on this topic.
And thank you, Joe and Matt, for jumping on and joining us at this, for the first half of the webinar.
Cool.
All right. Okay, so now we are going to switch gears. And we are going to look at renewable diesel and adjacent markets. John, am I jumping in?
No, yeah, keep going. Yeah.
Okay. So, first we have Alex DePillis from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. I always love the extra long name. He's a senior agricultural development coordinator. He's worked in a broad range of renewable energy technologies, wind, energy policy, land use permitting for wind and solar projects, and assessing wind and solar potential. He's developed and installed wind and solar projects for over 30 years and advises state personnel and farmers on renewable energy policy. So Alex, you ready to share your wisdom? John has your slides if you need us to go ahead and advance them, or if you want to share your own screen, let us know.
I'm going to share my own screen because I actually found an error since sending those slides to you. So I'm going to just do that here quick. See, share. And so are you seeing, oh no, here we go. How about that? Let's see.
Starting to see it?
How's that look?
There you go. That's perfect, Alex. Thanks.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'll be brief. It's really just going to do like a reality check in the purpose of why we would talk about oil seeds in Vermont. What's the potential? What's the carbon intensity? And then sort of a debate and some of the policy options. And is there potential for Vermont? And by the way, a lot of these slides, I'm just going to not even read the stuff. You can have it for later. But there's a whole rule of thumb that still holds, is that 10% of the land is needed to feed the draft power, whether it's horses or tractors. It doesn't matter. 10% of our farmers' land is what they need to cultivate their land, whether by either means. We have 1.2 million acres. Most of it is hay. That's the biggest crop, I guess. And then there's 650,000 other farmland acres, a lot of pasture, some vegetables. Oilseeds need good farmland. Why does Vermont grown maybe matter? I think, first of all, obviously, like Matt Coda and Stephen Dodge are saying, we don't have a lot of equipment or fuel options for off-road farm vehicles, and it's a drop-in fuel. And this is a way to do it immediately. NESCOM and others are all about mandating zero emissions vehicles. That's fine if you have those vehicles. We don't have them in the off-road and heavy-duty market, by and large. We, agriculture, are part of the problem, and we want to be part of the solution. We want that activity of growing these crops potentially. And guess what? Feed. Oilseed crops are 2/3 feed by mass, right? So this feed has starch and protein. People spend good money to buy soybean meal as feed, for example, and that's 2/3 of what this crop makes. Any of the oilseed will do about this ratio. So the four crops are sunflower. These are the four crops. We're learning about them. There are challenges. We've done some good trials. We could do, a lot of good stuff. Farmers can learn to grow stuff. You tell them to grow, what they would consider a weed. They'll figure out the best way to grow that weed, and they'll do it. So here's just an example of the oilseeds that were grown for about 7 years, trials, different kinds of oilseeds. Total varied a lot by year, but you can see that they actually learned, and they got from 200 pounds per acre to more like 800 with a lot of variation. So that's it it does vary. Like I said, the standard deviation, the statistical standard deviation was 400 pounds per acre. So we're bouncing around until we can dial things in. Of course, a lot depends on weather and so forth. But I guess I would say there's real potential. Camelina's gotten a lot of attention. It's an interesting crop. It's very, I think the most interesting thing about it is actually low fertilizer input, relatively speaking, and that it's a short season. And so, but there's also a lot of BS around camelina. It's, you know, not a food crop and all this other stuff. So, but I just want to show you some pictures of some of these crops. So here's this a 96-day crop starting April 17th in New York State. That's pretty decent for oilseed to be able to start that early. Here's what canola looks like. Canola is also an early season crop, potentially same family, I think. So it looks like a mustard seed, tiny little seeds. And here's what sunflowers look like. These guys grew them. They can be harvested with a corn type harvester instead of a, so, you know, you have to think about the harvesting equipment. Soybeans have their own harvesters. That's a crop that we don't grow a lot of, but with climate change, it'll be more friendly in more parts of Vermont to grow that crop. So food versus fuel. I really want to just mention this in passing in a way, but it can be it's sort of a good part of our policy discussion. People are saying about solar on farmland, oh, it's really not that much. It's only going to be 0.5% of all the farmland, blah, blah, blah. Plus, they love to say, oh, and by the way, you can get a lot more miles per acre on solar than on corn. So that's the ethanol versus solar trope. And of course, it's ridiculous because these crops provide feed, and that's something that people would have to grow anyhow. So food versus development is always a tension. It's an old debate, and saying, as the solar people say, it could be worse is not good policy making. It's BS. It's already a choice Vermont made 40 years ago with Act 250 to make up for farmland that gets developed. And just one more thing about this debate. As I said, oilseeds would likely substitute for corn. The land is needed to grow crops for feed. So here's this exercise I didn't get around to, but I was just thinking, like, how many acres of oilseed are needed to make 10% of all Vermont diesel? Now, I could look at just the transportation diesel. You know, Matt broke it down for us. I think he said 40 million gallons for on-road, off-road, and heating. But I haven't done these numbers. It would be interesting to do them, but I did some similar numbers. And as I say, on a farm basis, it's 10%. And then how would this number compare to solar, for instance? There's a lot of ways to slice and dice this and get some sense of it. But I think I didn't know other people were going to say this, but it's totally true. When we think about cropping and transportation, it does have it's a considerable expense to move crops around. And so you need to think about where you're going to do this. So grow them near a feed mill and a crushing plant, right? Near livestock that can use the seed meal. And there's economies of scales on acres. Transportation cost is going to want you to have a smaller radius, but you can get to a bigger radius if you use bigger trucks and you're harvesting bigger acreages up to a point. So regionalization, I think, is going to be really helpful. Here's an example, like let's look at a 25-mile radius, okay? So 25 miles, not too far to drive around a feed mill. And 10% of those acres, let's just use 10% of the 25-mile radius. That's 125,000 acres, pretty good number. It's also, however, 2.1% of the land in Vermont. That's significant. And it's 10% of the acres being grown and being farmed in Vermont. And it's more than all of the acres of corn grown in Vermont. So that's pretty intense use of land if we're going to do something like that to keep it. It's a lot of land, even though it's only 25 miles. If you could get further out to 50-mile radius or so forth, and by the way, the better way to do this, of course, is a GIS analysis that does drive time. That would be the way to do it. Carbon intensity, I did look up some numbers here. I have the spreadsheet for California pathways. I looked up, 28 data points. 8 of them were canola, 20 were soybean, 2 renewable diesel, and there was one from Mississippi, which I want to show you, which was different, but these are the basic numbers. These are the averages of the carbon intensity grams per megajoule. Weird stuff here in this spreadsheet. I'll just be brief. You can see how they describe the pathway in the spreadsheet, they talk about North American sourced canola from anywhere, right? And then in the next one, they talk about Argentinian soybean oil transported by tanker and then distributed by barge. And then this weird one from Mississippi, 83, Midwest soybean transported by rail and then rail out to California. So transportation doesn't make a big difference in the actual carbon intensity unless you're talking about really long rail pathways. It is an expense in getting the crop to the plant, though. So carbon intensity, open questions. I did not find any carbon intensities for sunflower and camelina as feedstocks. I don't know. Some people claim that they can account for the seed meal as changing the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. I didn't see it in GREET. So that's an open question. Policy options, I've listed a bunch here. I really just like, I think with a lot of people have, if you can, a set aside for Vermont oilseeds. And part of the reason is that you want to have an economic development component for this. Why should everybody else pay more for renewable diesel if there's nothing in it for Vermonters? And the thing that could be in it for Vermonters could be conversion facilities, another one. That's what Minnesota, they mandated ethanol. Okay, that's it. That's all I got. Regional approach, by all means. Thank you.
Wow, Alex, that's something to chew on. All right, so we're going to now move to Ken Jones and hear a little bit about the clean heat standard, and then we'll get back to Alex and Ken with some questions about looking at, how we get feedstock growing here in Vermont. Okay, so Ken is up next. He's on his phone. He's a retired researcher who has spent most of the last 30 years looking at the overlap between the economy and the environment. He was an economic research analyst with Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development. And he's worked with the technical industry group to the Public Utilities to attempt to structure the clean heat standard in Vermont that Matt Poda had also mentioned and worked on. He maintains positions on the Clean Energy Development Board and the Science and Data Subcommittee for the Vermont Climate Council. So Ken, take it over.
Okay, Peggy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So yeah, I'm also in a parking lot because today is the day of the Energy Action Network meeting here in Vermont, and the overlap here is that, and it's related to the clean heat standard work, is that we still have a very, very significant, whether we call it messaging or political posture position with regards to renewable diesel. There's a great deal of pushback, and Alex implied some of this about people very, very reluctant to consider a lower carbon liquid fuel at this time, touting that we can just go for full electrification. Given time and working with folks, and we did this through the Clean Heat Standard Technical Advisory Group, there's I'll say, begrudging acceptance of the possibility. But in terms of the actual writing of final rules, that avenue, but also just the straight market avenue, there is a very strong message out there that's quite negative with regards to seed oil-based renewable diesel. And so in this forum, I encourage the development of stronger message, more consistent message. And I also rely on the work in California because they do consume literally billions of gallons of the product and have analyzed the daylights out of it to come up with carbon intensity values, which my technical advisory group ultimately accepted. But still, this understanding of the use of the remaining product from, when you squeeze the oil out of a product, you have this feed, and therefore it has another use. You're not just harvesting food product for energy, but it still has a significant role in the food cycle. Again, those messages need to be out there. And as I say, Vermont's not going to have a clean heat standard in the next short period of time, but there's a very significant appetite among consumers for a lower carbon fuel. And while heat pump installation is happening at a good rate, there are literally 100,000, and Vermont's tiny, 100,000 homes that will be a long time before they can ever convert to full electrification. And in the meantime, they will use a fossil-based heating oil to heat their home. And as I say, there is an appetite for a lower carbon fuel, and a drop-in fuel that allows people to have a lower carbon impact is, say, there's an attraction to that, but that attraction needs to be more communicated generally, so that if our fuel oil dealers want to market a renewable heating oil, that they don't get pushback from the folks that are very good at voicing messages about how evil renewable diesel is. And so, you know, again, that's my major thrust here, is that we need help with the messaging piece. And then I know the early part of this discussion is the other part. We need to develop a market, and one of the pieces of the group that I'm with here today does work with municipalities, and municipalities not just in terms of their vehicle fleets, but many municipalities run buildings that use heating oil. And our in the city of Montpelier, our wastewater facility needs to use heating oil in order to heat the process for managing the liquid wastes. And they would, I wouldn't say love to, they know that there's an opportunity for switching out their heating oil with a more renewable product. So in terms of this developing a market, please don't forget the heating oil side. And again, institutional buyers, schools, and municipalities can help develop the demand for a renewable product, so that we can get Vermont to a place where there are several million gallons, so that the fuel oil dealers have access to reasonable quantities, so that they can market the product to more Vermonters that, I say, have this appetite for a lower carbon product. That's my spiel.
Ken, that's a great spiel. You know, keep working the room at the EAN Summit. I'm sorry I couldn't be there this year for that. Okay, so we have a couple of questions and comments in the chat here.
I don't know if everybody can see the chat, so I know that some things have been responded to, but maybe we could just like read out those responses as well.
Go ahead, Lorelai. Go.
So we have a question from Peggy. So if you guys can't see the chat, Peggy asked, what would the process and timeline look like for Vermont to move into RD processing and refining? And I don't know if has that been answered yet. I don't think so.
Yes, Stephen Dodge responded. Yeah, you know, basically to say, like, the refining, forget about it. But processing, you know, kind of speaking more to maybe lean in a little bit to Alex. Maybe Alex, can you share a little bit on what it could look like for Vermont? What do we need? What are the pieces we need in order?
I don't know how the whole infrastructure works. I mean, clearly there's different ways to move stuff around. It's a hell of a lot better to move oil to a refinery than to move oil seeds, I assume, because you just have to move a lot less material to a given location. So we could have a crushing facility that could crush a lot of different things for oils and feed. And that's sort of just a feed mill function of how big. We've had seed oil crushing facility discussions and grain mill discussions. So those are feasible size facilities. And then maybe, you know, they're typically on rail already. So if you could get seed crushing oil at a feed mill onto rail, then to a conversion facility, maybe that works. So yeah, that's my guess. Again, I don't know how all the stuff gets moved around.
Great,
Yeah.
and I was.
And
go ahead, go ahead.
and the other advantage to having the crushing mill locally is that, as we've noted, that 2/3 of the product is a feed product. Therefore, you also have the feed back close to the agricultural demand, and so you're not shipping the seed product away and then having to ship the feed back.
Stephen also just said in the chat to not forget about used cooking oil with plenty of UCO around with a low carbon intensity. Um, uh, John Gagne asked, have there been any conversations at the national level on whether or not the domestic or global ag markets could supply enough feedstock to meet RD demand? And Jesse may have some more to say about that. But he also responded in the chat saying that as with veg oil, no, we cannot replace all petrodiesel with RD.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess what I'm getting at here is, we're having all these conversations about market expansion, and I think there's this concern that I've heard a couple times of, although we could probably meet the existing demand of renewable diesel, I think there's a stat that like 70, maybe 80% of the current market goes to California. So, what does that leave for the New England market, the Northeast fleets? What does that look like as the market continues to build out? If production increases, eventually it'll hit some sort of equilibrium point where, supply and demand will sort of equal out. But if demand continues to increase, how do fleets navigate that process? Or maybe it's in-home heating oil. Like, what do those opportunities look like? What are the challenges, and what are those limits that could pop up in the future? Yeah, go ahead, Jesse.
I would say if you have to choose which vehicles or fleets prioritize the use of renewable diesel, it would be older fleets. So the emission systems on newer vehicles pretty much eliminate all or most of the carbon particulate matter from vehicles that burn petroleum diesel. And so there's a very small benefit using renewable diesel. Other than the emission systems don't get all dirty and you don't end up with those issues. So there's a maintenance savings. But from emissions standpoint, I mean, the life cycle carbon emissions is much less renewable, but benefits are much bigger in older diesels that spew out black smoke. If you put renewable in there, you won't get that particulate matter. So I think if you had to prioritize, older vehicles would be better. We all benefit no matter where it's burned, but older vehicles, that's what I would prioritize.
Yeah, there's no shortage of old vehicles in New England too.
Yeah,
Or
and
off-road. I don't
that's
know
what I was
the
gonna
emission
say.
standards for off-road, but if I'm assuming they're less. The emission standards aren't as strict. So yeah, off-road would probably be better.
Yeah, Alex, do you have a sense? I mean, I've certainly been on a few farms, and there's some kind of relic tractors out there. I don't know how much they're being utilized actually, but certainly looking in the ag sector, what do you have a sense of what the kind of emission regulations are for the off-road vehicles that are used on farms?
Sorry, I don't. I think they probably have to produce tier 4 or whatever it is engines. So I'm not sure how that works. I'm not sure I understand the question. Is the manufacturer of them regulated? Yes. Are the emissions regulated on a per vehicle basis? No. It's a
Right.
mobile source. So it's not going to be regulated in that way.
Okay, thank you.
And then I had a question, which Jesse very promptly answered, which I appreciate the answer, Jesse. And the question I had was about opportunities or research in using quote unquote unconventional sources for renewable diesel, which is prompted by a project at NREL, which is using pistachio shells for electricity. And I was wondering if there's anything similar in the RD world. And Jesse may be able to talk about this more, but and expand on his answer. But there are some of these unconventional resources and research into RD sources, such as carbon and hydrogen, and making out of it garbage. But as many things, it hasn't become cost effective yet. So.
I pressed share my screen. I don't know if I did.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
good.
pathways to staff.
Yeah, so this isn't the one I was looking for, but you can see the different ways that you can SAF and renewable. These are kind of, you can talk about them interchangeably. They're made the same way. But of course, as I mentioned in the chat, you can make it from air, literally taking the carbon and hydrogen out of air to make it. That's not really economically viable yet. Then there's the fats way, HEFA, which is what you guys primarily spoke about today. There's also corn, and then there's using garbage. And I think the numbers in here show the estimated projected capacities for these feedstocks. So it looks like corn can do 50 billion gallons of SAF or renewable, either one. Garbage has about 50 billion. There was one other thing I had that showed the ceiling for like cellulosic material, and that's like tenfold more. So that's where the main feedstock in the future has less limitations, whereas used cooking oil is actually maybe one of the most limited limited feedstocks. But I had a better graph or chart, and if I can find it, I'll share it.
So just in sum, like the keep producing trash as humans, and we can produce some renewable fuels.
And we can do it right now. It's just not cost. It's not feasible cost-wise. So.
Right. Okay, thanks, Jesse. Scott, I see your hand up.
Yeah, Peggy, thank you. And Jesse, it's important everybody understands as well that just because there are additional available feedstocks out there doesn't mean we can use those. So in order to use those here, at least within the US, they must have an approved pathway. So SAF, for instance, synthetic aviation fuels are regulated by the FAA. And right now, those regulations require aviation fuel to be produced from petroleum sources unless there are an approved pathway under ASTM. So garbage, for instance, you can make it, you just can't use it at that point because it wouldn't be approved. So a lot of other instances like that, even on the RD side, where if it doesn't have a pathway, it means it can't participate under the RFS, can't generate a RIN, tax credits, and so it gets really complicated really quick.
With SAFs, like, I think gaining a lot of traction, especially this year. I feel like I've heard it everywhere now. Kind of like renewable diesel. Are there conversations happening about exploring those other pathways or creating opportunities to use other production methods?
There are. It's one of those catch-22s. Do you create and approve a fuel that in theory might work before you ever test it? Or do you wait until a fuel is produced and tested to ensure that it's what we would call fit for purpose before you approve it? So a lot of discussions, yes, but it's going to be very slow moving forward.
Okay, thanks. That's some good insight. Does anybody else have any questions? We just covered a lot of information from just doing a quick recap. We talked about MBTA pilot and some procurement strategies and challenges, RFP development, and what pieces of price can sort of fluctuate and really adapt to the fleet and the needs. And we also talked about this big need for cooperative purchasing. And I don't think we have a firm answer yet on who will play that role in New England yet. I think we've got a good idea of like who might be a good fit, but maybe some more conversations that Peggy and I can have offline with folks in between these sessions to talk through some of those opportunities, what they could look like, who are the players. And I think in our smaller markets, we recognize some sort of group procurement strategy will kind of be essential for widespread deployment at some level. So if anybody has any thoughts on that or wants to connect, between now and the next session, which is in February, would love to talk through what that process could look like or who might want to be involved in that.
Yeah, and no pressure, New York and Massachusetts. But, come on, we punch above our weight in our little states, but we really need bigger markets. All right, John, do you want to, I guess, hit the recap slides on our?
Yeah, well, first we can maybe
Oh, wait.
share some quick updates
Yeah.
from between last session and this session. So Peggy and I went to go to Massachusetts to visit Logan Airport and some of the folks from Massachusetts Port Authority. So I'll just let you share a photo of us from there.
I mean, not to geek out too much, but this was really exciting. First of all, to go behind the scenes at Logan Airport. I mean, it was like they needed like a copy of our passport, and we could only stand like in this like little triangle before we were allowed in. But it was a pretty amazing just to see these really big vehicles, and the fact that we were standing, many of us who work in clean cities and communities spend a fair amount of time in garages. And these were with enormous vehicles, and we're at an airport, and I didn't get a headache from like the diesel fumes because this is renewable diesel. So really just also a benefit for drivers and technicians and anyone around them. But anyway, go ahead, John. I'll let you
Yeah,
keep
well,
going.
I mean, we specifically went to Massport because we had connected with them about their pilot program. They had deployed it at Logan Airport, some of the other locations, and found a lot of great success from it. And we wanted to go visit just to see what's going on. I was talking to Peggy on the way there. I was like, we're just going to be looking at a bunch of trucks that typically run on diesel and they're just running on renewable diesel. It's the same exact trucks. There's no special fueling infrastructure. At the time, they had done temporary storage tanks on site, um, just for pilot purposes, but they had already gotten rid of those by the time that we had been there. So it was literally just seeing the behind the scenes of Logan Airport. But it was cool because we got to talk to some of the folks that are driving the vehicles, some of the fleet managers, and they had nothing but good things to say about it. And the vehicles that are using the fuel are indicated by this sort of large green renewable diesel only sticker. And they decided that the pilot went so well, like I mentioned earlier, that they released an RFP to transition the majority of their operations to renewable diesel. And I think what's kind of interesting to share here, because, Peggy and I would be ignorant to not acknowledge that Maine and Vermont are both ZEV states. And over the last 4 years, we've really been focusing on those zero emission vehicle technologies, electrifying anything that can go electric as our decarbonization strategy. It's worked really well in the light duty sector. It's really easy to replace a passenger vehicle with an electric vehicle. Of course, there's still range anxiety and rural challenges, but for the most part, it's possible. Where you start running into these challenges are, which I think everyone can probably relate to in some way, shape, or form, is the medium and heavy duty sector here, where these vehicles are large, they are running in all 4 seasons. They're expensive. They require high power dedicated charging infrastructure. And there's just a lot more components that go into this process. And so, I think what's cool to show here is that Massport hasn't abandoned their electrification strategy, but they're really looking at this as a bridge fuel or a temporary solution I think, their overall messaging is to electrify anything that can and anything that can't use renewable diesel for now. They're using renewable diesel in some of their shuttles. They're using it on the airport snow plows, the snow melters, some of those mission critical things. So I think the purpose of just sharing this is that there is this fleet, and as we heard earlier, MBTA and some of the other folks in the New England region are using this fuel. It's been, it's been a success to them. I think they kind of realize, like, as they're going through this pilot process, they're like, oh, it is just, we hear it's a drop in fuel. They kind of want to just test it to make sure that it really is a drop in fuel. They're like, it's a drop in fuel. We can use it. We are using it. And so that confidence to continue moving forward with it is there. And so, just sort of highlighting this as an opportunity for other New England fleets is if we can sort of come together, explore this group procurement process, and aggregate that demand in some way, um, it works. And, I think we've also heard from folks out west, Montana, the British Columbia, California, like all those other Western and even colder climates than what we might run into, the fuel works. So that's sort of the big thing we wanted to share. And then, we'll keep you all updated as we hear updates from other fleets around New England or even Massport as they continue to invest in renewable diesel for their fleet. And then the other thing that we wanted to share was we were at a Clean Air Northeast Partners meeting in Cambridge this past, well, I guess in September, so earlier this fall. And, we had kind of presented on this working group and some of the objectives, but people that were also there were the MBTA. So both people from the rail and the bus lines. And so we had sort of this conversation on how do we decarbonize the transportation sector from a bunch of different angles, right? Renewable diesel came up in, I think, every presentation in some way, shape, or form as an alternative. And one thing that, when as Peggy and I sort of wrapped up our piece, we had gone after the MBTA folks. Everyone wanted to talk about renewable diesel. And even the folks from MBTA who weren't necessarily talking to each other from the folks that are coordinating the bus system and the rail system, made that strong connection after that, started talking to Massport and, there is this growing interest. There are these bigger fleets that are slowly inching it further north from the New York City and the New Jersey ports. So, I think our sort of, as we're thinking about how to wrap this process up and start talking about where do we go from here, it's really going to be looking at those implementation or pilot opportunities, really looking at that group cooperative purchasing, bringing some of those folks together, and exploring some of those options. And that kind of brings me to this survey that Peggy and I have out to folks. And we are not sharing this information with anybody, but just trying to collect some information for our internal usage from fleets. If folks are interested in filling this out, it just gives us a sense of what fleets in New England are, really interested in doing a pilot program, how much fuel you're using, so we can have some of those aggregated numbers to have some of these discussions, either at the state level or start bringing these to a more regional context. I think the theme that we heard throughout this is it needs to be some sort of regional approach. This is not a thing that will be solved by Maine or Vermont trying to, bring in this mass demand from our smaller states. And, there's this real opportunity to have a collective approach for it. So I think that's sort of a good place to end on. Also, just quickly touch on some of the key takeaways that we had discussed. some sort of this idea following the regional strategy approach, some sort of regional approach to a low carbon fuel standard, or some sort of regional policy that could really drive the market opportunities in the Northeast. Not pointing any fingers. Maybe some folks at some of the state air agencies might be interested in taking this question on. Something that could be explored. Hopefully, maybe there's some interest in the future for that process. If anybody wants to chat, we're here. Our states right now don't have any formal mandates, which creates challenges to sell to our markets. Without that big anchor fleet, it creates a lot more roadblocks for pricing. And the other thing that we heard was the agriculture sector can be part of the solution. I think we are pretty ag heavy states in both Maine and Vermont. There's definitely plenty of agriculture in upstate New York and some other New England states. So there is an opportunity for the agriculture industry to be involved, whether it's doing domestic seed oil crushing or whatever that process looks like. I think it's something that could be an interesting opportunity to explore. And then the other big thing is if renewable diesel market supply becomes a concern in the future, I don't think we're at that point yet, at least not to my knowledge or to anything that I've heard yet. I think there's some borderline conversations there, but if there needs to be a prioritization, renewable diesel will have the biggest impact in older vehicles and older engines that sort of predate that EPA regulation update. So those are sort of the big picture things that we heard. I don't know if there's anything else, Peggy, that I missed there.
I think just tying in the thermal sector as well, looking at
Yeah.
the, 70 million gallons of home heating oil, that will also have a positive impact on emissions. So again, pulling all these pieces together to look at what this demand for renewable diesel could potentially be, tying in our kind of agricultural sector, not just as users, but also as producers. And I don't know, waving our magic wand, making this all happen. But John did put the renewable diesel survey link in the chat. Please share that. Doesn't have to be anyone in our states. If there are folks outside of Maine or Vermont, please go ahead. And then Jesse just added some information on his renewable diesel working group. We got our idea from Jesse to do something more East Coast, but there's a lot to learn from other parts of the states on RD.
Yeah, the renewable diesel discussions, I think, in our area are still very fresh. So still pretty high level, introducing this to a lot of folks. I think Jesse does a really good job at going like sort of the next level deeper and can answer a lot of really interesting technical questions or processes surrounding renewable diesel. So if you're interested in learning more, definitely recommend registering for that and signing up. Peggy and I have both attended several sessions, and it's always a great group of folks that join. So yeah, I think the last thing that we'll sort of end off with is our next session. I believe in the email, I accidentally said it was February 5th. It's actually February 4th on Wednesday from noon to 1:30 again. I will be much more intentional about sending a registration email reminder from Zoom because for some reason it does not add the call to people's calendars automatically, which is a bad feature. So we'll make sure that it's front and center for everyone and really going to be looking at how do we move this group or some of the fleets that are interested in piloting into more of an implementation phase. Hopefully we'll be able to have more conversations around that group procurement or collective purchasing process, what that could look like, who are the players involved, and sort of leave us off with a pathway forward. So Peggy and I, under this specific funding opportunity and program, are really responsible for these 4 working group sessions, but I think we're both looking for opportunities to continue these conversations with folks. I think we've built a lot of interest and momentum in the region, and we want to hold on to that as much as we can. So if anybody has any additional thoughts, questions, comments, inquiries, want to share information with the group, reach out to us at any time. Happy to have a conversation. Happy to give you some space in this group to share information, because the whole point of this process is just to create peer-to-peer opportunities. So thanks everyone for joining today. Thanks for everyone's input. Always great to just bring people together and have these conversations. So looking forward to connecting again in February.
Thank you all. Have a
Thank-
great afternoon.
Thanks everyone.